Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are actually in the midst of a comment that talks about the fact that because Abram refused to take anything and mentions specifically Abram in his conversation with the king of Sodom mentions that he wouldn't even take a shoe latchet from him, right? Or a thread or a shoe latchet. The Jewish people were given two very, very precious mitzvot, the thread of the tzitzit, the blue thread, and here I'm looking at the Hebrew up here, and the strap of the tefillin, right? Two profound mitzvot. So let's take a look at what goes on here. It was a fairly lengthy Torah T'mimah that we were examining, and so we're still in the middle of it. And he initially talks about he gives Rashi's explanation, and which has to do with the fact that Abraham refused to take benefit from theft. He makes some interesting points about it. He himself, that is the Torah Temimah, says that perhaps the reason is because it was a miraculous victory on Abraham's part, and one is not supposed to take personal benefit from any miraculous event that helps you, that benefits you. And that was the reason. So it's a suggestion going on a new idea. Veda and know de beprate mitzvot tzitzit, that when it comes to the details, the specifics of mitzvah tzitzit, of the commandment of tzitzit, right, the fringes, cholkim Rashi v'Rambam, that Rashi and Maimonides disagree. They have a difference of opinion. The Rashi, because according to Rashi, tzarich latil shnei chutin lavan ushnei chutin chelet. That what you do is you take four strands, right? Four strands, and you double them up to get eight. And according to Rashi, two of those strands have to be white, lavan, and two of those strands have to be blue. That's how Rashi would construct his tzitzit. Ule Rambam, but according to the Rambam, tzarich shlosha chutin lavan, three of those threads are white, v'chut echad tchelet, and one of them is tchelet, that blue. Ve'ien mizeh betosafot yontov. So he says you can see further details regarding this. Tosafot Yontef is a commentary that appears in the traditional publication of the Mishnah. Yom Tov Littman Heller was his name. Along with the Mishnah, if you study Mishnah in its traditional form, on the one side of the page you have Bertanora, Ovadia Bertanora, who is like the Rashi for the Mishnah. And on the other side, you have Tosafot Yontef, which is again, just like Tosafot, goes into details regarding, and it's very challenging and sophisticated discussions regarding what's going on in the Mishnah. So Bertanor is there to explain the Mishnah. Tosafot Yontef takes you deeper into the details regarding the Mishnah. So if you look at Perek Dalet, chapter 4, Mishnah Aleph, so Mishnayot are divided into orders, into tractates, and then into chapters, which are known as prakim. And each chapter is divided into smaller pieces that are known as Mishnayot, the Menachot. So in tractate Menachot, Menachot has to do with meal offerings. It turns out that that is the tractate in the Mishnah that deals with the mitzvah of tzitzit. So he's just giving you a cross-reference if you want to look into it further. V'hinei, and behold, indeed, im ki ein lahavi ra'aya muchrechet midivrei agada, even though one is not supposed to, you can't bring compelling logic from agadic sources, right? From legendary sources. It's not a halachic discussion. It is on the level of legend or that kind of analysis, literary analysis, perhaps. B'chol zeh, nevertheless, nehirin pishtut halashon, right? That it becomes clear, right? Clarifies the basic meaning of the expression or the language, Shezacha Avraham lechut shel tchelet. In other words, if we look at the Agada having to do with this particular interpretation, it appears that from the language itself, that Abraham merited a thread of tchelet, right? If we look at it, right? Lechut shel tchelet, that's what it says, right? That's what it says there in this passage. I think it's from Sota, that it was a thread of blue, right? And this comment is not a halachic analysis. It is a midrash, right? Kedat HaRambam, which would follow the opinion, that would support the opinion of the Rambam. De midin mitzvah tzitzit, hi rak chut echad shel tchelet. That from the law, right, the legal element of the commandment of tzitzit, it just requires one thread of blue. It says chut shel tchelet, a thread of blue. Rashi piresh kan lechut shel tchelet, right? And Rashi explains here that when referring to a thread of blue, letzitzit, he's talking about, he sees the chut shel tchelet as that in this context here, it's talking about the mitzvah of tzitzit. In other words, Rashi doesn't take it in its literal sense, but says that the two mitzvot, and when it says here a thread of tchelet, it's simply referring to tzitzit, right? So, ad kan lashono, and that's a quote there. Vayitachen, and it would appear, shehirgish bama sheha'arnu, okay, and it would appear that he sensed in what we've explained, ulefi shitato, and according to his position, de ve'inyan shnei chutin shel chelet, that the reason for two threads of blue, lachen piresh de kavanat halashon lechut shel tchelet, and that's why that if you look at the general context of this whole discussion, which is saying that that it was for this kind of behavior that Abraham was rewarded. That's why when it says a thread of blue, it's simply talking about the commandment, the mitzvah tzitzit stam. It's simply talking about the commandment itself of putting on tzitzit, threads, and attaching fringes to the garment. Aval ledat harambam, but according to the opinion of the Rambam, it paresh halashon bedikduk nimratz. But according to the Rambam, he explains the expression up there, right, with a rigorous parsing, the dok, and that's a good way to explain it. QED. V'da, and no, ki b'yalkut v'tanchuma. These are two midrashim. We've referred to them before. Yalkut Shmoni, right? It's a midrash on the entire Bible. Utanchuma. The Tanchuma is a midrash on the Torah. Uv'a baraita, there is a source of Mishnah contemporary with Mishnah, right? Bazeh, in regarding this matter, vegaris ba, and there, in other words, it talks about this concept, and there the version of the text is zachu lechut shel tchelet. The descendants of Abraham merited a thread of blue, ulemin al shel chalitza, not the strap of the tefillin, but rather because he refers to the shoe latchet, right? That the shoe of chalitza. And just to review chalitza, chalitza has to do with the levirate marriage when a man who's married dies without any children, and he has a brother, and the brother is supposed to marry the widow, right? And then provide a child for the deceased individual. So right, the brother has died without children. However, there's an option. There's an option that if the brother doesn't want to do that, he can say, I do not want to do this. And there's a ceremony where the widow removes a shoe from his foot and makes a declaration, right? And that's this shoe of chalitza. Chalitza means to remove the shoe. V'yesh lomar, and one might say, so why is it a different version? It's a whole different interpretation, right? The one is tefillin. This is the shoe of chalitza. The lo necha leoto baraita. That this baraita that we're quoting here, right, isn't comfortable, right? Ha'inyan de ritzu. Sorry, okay, forgive me. That in that particular version, in the Yalkut Shimoni and in the Tanchuma, right? He doesn't like the explanation Ha'inyan ritzu'ah shel tefillin, that the strap of tefillin mipnei she'ein ze merumaz yafeh b'lashon na'al. Why? Because it's not so clear, right? It's not, the reference to tefillin isn't so clear as the thread, right? The thread we understand, tzitzit, but there it said shoe latchet. So the fact that it talks about a shoe, that's why he goes in that direction. Rak mishum dezeh v'zeh oru. The only connection that tefillin and a shoe have is that they're both made out of leather. That's the only connection. Ulevaraita shelefanenu. However, for this baraita that is in front of us, this source that is in front of us, where it talks about the tefillin, lo necha, why doesn't he like the shoe example? Why does he feel uncomfortable about it? Ha'inyan min al shel chalitza, that this business of the shoe of chalitza, mipnei depur anuthi. The reason is because this ceremony of removing the shoe, in a sense, is a punishment to this brother, this surviving brother, who refuses to provide seed for his deceased brother. And the removing of the shoe is, in a sense, it's an insulting kind of thing. V'lo shayach kol kach. And so it's not the person who went with the tefillin and didn't go with the shoe. He doesn't feel it's so appropriate. Halashon zachu, when you're saying they merited, right? They're meriting something that, in a sense, is a punishment. So that's why the dok, and he says, this makes sense, right? This makes sense. Before I go on, are there any comments on what we've done so far?
No.
Otherwise, I will move on. Okay, here goes. So, right, biladai, right? I would say this, I'd understand this. Ex other than rak asher achlu hanarim. In other words, you're talking about benefiting from the king of Sodom in any way, right? He says, not for me, only that which the young men have consumed, the chelek hanashim, and the part that is due to the people, asher halchu iti, who went with me. And who are the people who went with me? Aner, Eshkol, Mamre, Aner, Eshkol, Mamre. Hey, Miku, they can take, right? Maybe I want to be, righteous, etc., but they don't have to go that way, okay? Yeah, Chelkam, they can take their portion that's due to them for the participation that they had in the battle, right? So that they can take. Rak asher achlu, only that which they consumed. In other words, the other people who went with me, I personally am not going to, Abraham is saying, I personally am not going to benefit in any way from you and from this battle. Amar Rabbi Abba, said Rabbi Abba, Kasher Gezel Hanechal. It's when something has been stolen and consumed. Something was stolen and then consumed. It's a tough situation, right? It is very tough. She'afilu tzadikim gmurim, because even completely righteous people, ein yecholim lachziro, they cannot return it. If you've stolen something and consumed it, it's done. There's no way to make restitution of that particular item, right? Shne'emar bil adai, right? He uses this term, accepting rak asher achluha ne'arim, that which the young people ate. In other words, ideally, Abraham wouldn't have wanted to take a thing from the king of Sodom, all right? But while he himself couldn't, there was stuff that had clearly been consumed, right? Except for that, right? So anything that they had consumed already, etc., they had benefited. They benefited from the king of Sodom, in a sense. Let's take a look. Okay. Ein hakavana. So the intention here is Shelo haya Avraham rotzeh lachazir gezel mamash hane'echal. Right? We shouldn't think here from this statement that Abraham lo haya Avraham rotzeh, that he did not want. In other words, if you read that statement, we should not infer from it that Abraham didn't want to return anything stolen from what was consumed. The Chalila Lomar, and we should, God forbid, we should say such things, right? So that the kasher there doesn't mean, that he didn't want to return it, right? V'tzarich lomar, and we have to say, al pi ma shekatuv bepasuk hakodem, and we have to say, on the basis of what's written in the previous verse, daha shelo ratza Avraham lakachat mehashlal, that the fact that Abraham did not want to take benefit from the booty, right? Haya lo meikar hadin, wasn't only from a purely legal sense, mishum demin hadin, because we already know from that previous comment that the booty that was taken wouldn't be considered theft. It wouldn't be considered stolen, right? We went into that whole issue, right? Demin hadim haya zoche bahen mamash. He had every right to benefit from it from a legal standpoint. Shemosh kemoshe katavnu sham, as we wrote there. We made a note of it. Ella, right? But lifnim mishurat hadin. He wanted to go beyond the letter of the law. He wanted to go more than the law required of him. V'lachen, and for this reason, yesh lomar, we can say, shehaya dan she'eno kidai lasod lifnim mishurat hadin begezel hanechmar. So this is a little difficult for me, but I'll do the best I can. Shehaya dan, that he considered, he judged, right? She'eno kidai, right? Lasod, that, and I don't know if he's talking about in this context, that he was not kidai, he was not worthy, that when it came to consumed robbed property, right, he could not act within the letter of the law. After all, it was consumed. It may have been consumed legally, that it was legal that it was done, but he wanted to go beyond it. Abraham wanted to go beyond the letter of the law. Right? In other words, again, the language here is challenging me, right? According to this, in other words, right? According to this explanation that we just gave, that kasher gezel hanechal ba'alma, that when we use this expression gezel hanechal ba'alma, that in general it is hard to, it's difficult when stuff that is stolen is consumed. Bistam anashim, that refers to people in general. She'afilu Avraham Avinu, that is to say, that even Abraham, our forefather, Shaya Oseh Kol Ma'asav Lifnim Mishurat Adin, who acted regarding within, beyond the letter of the law in everything, Lo Matzah Lenachon Lahachmir Begizel. He did not find it appropriate to be machmir, in other words, to be really strict, begizel hanechal, when it came to material that was stolen, that was consumed, lasot, to be able to, here we go, ulahashiv lifnim mishurata, and to return it within the letter of the law, right, beyond the letter of the law. Okay, and in this sense, piresh Maharsha ba'ofen acher, and in regards to this, the Maharsha is Shlomo Idels. He is a commentator, major player in the back of the Talmud. He's not on the main page of the Talmud. He's of the Vilna Shas, but you will find him there. And his commentary is both on the halacha. He has halachic discussion and also agadic discussion. And he has a different interpretation of what's going on here. And this is probably a good place for us to stop today, and we'll be starting a new chapter with God's help at our next lesson. And I'm going to stop the share and invite you to whatever, if you'd like to. Ooh, sorry. We'll invite you to make comments if you would like. Any thoughts before I stop the recording? Were you able to follow what I was trying to translate?
Um, I think going beyond the letter of the law is often looked down upon, as opposed to just, going by the law. I mean, not just,
Within Judaism, you're saying?
yes.
I
I
don't
mean,
really.
yeah, I think that's why we don't have a lot of, like hermetic monks and things like that. And then there's the strange fire incident. I just think that people, um, like even currently, kind of look down on somebody kind of being, rigorous about going above and beyond. It,
So I
seems smug and
Isn't that the definition of orthodox, though?
not above and beyond, I would hope. I mean,
No, I think it is. I think they do. They
okay.
go
So
above and beyond.
can I try and explain this? So Lauren, I think it has to do with context. Okay, and you gave the example of Aaron's sons, right? They weren't going beyond the letter of the law. They were making up law for themselves because it says it was not required. On the other hand, if you, as a personal decision, not to show off, but just in a quiet way, do more, if the mitzvah is to tithe and you choose to give 15%, not because you have to show off, but because you want to show appreciation, okay? That is not looked down on at all. In fact, we have this whole concept of hidur mitzvah, and the whole concept of beautifying mitzvahs is going beyond the letter of the law. What David said in terms of orthodoxy, I would understand him to be in the context of gzeirot. In other words, where the rabbis said, yeah, you're not allowed to light a fire on Shabbat, and now we're going to impose the laws of muktzah, right, where you're not even allowed to touch matches. That would be going beyond the letter of the law. But here we're talking about something personal, which is what you were talking about when you used the example of Aaron's sons. But the trouble with what Aaron's sons did is that they were showing off in a way, right? One of the explanations of why they died is because they were, quote, teaching Moreh Halacha lifnei Rabban. That must be the truth because it's confetti, right? That they were basically saying this is what is required to the people who are around them, and they hadn't asked permission from Moses and Aaron. That when you do this, you really have to be very respectful and not do something that in some ways undermines the authority of people who have that authority legitimately. So context is very important, but in terms of the ways of righteousness, going beyond the simple requirements, again, depending on what that's going to result in, you have to look at it carefully, is something actually that's a matter of merit.
Yeah.
Is this, again, I would ask, is this making sense?
yeah.
Okay. All right. With that, I will stop the recording.